Still confused? Well, so's Nicodemus. Maybe a story about a weird snake on a pole thing would help. Let's find out. We're in John chapter 3, verses 9 through 15. Nicodemus said to Jesus, "How can these things be?" Jesus answered him, "Are you the teacher of Israel, and yet you do not understand these things? Truly, truly, I say to you, we speak of what we know and bear witness to what we have seen, but you do not receive our testimony. If I have told you earthly things and you do not believe, how can you believe if I tell you heavenly things? No one has ascended into heaven except he who descended from heaven, the Son of Man. And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life." So, if you were with us last time for a 5-minute devotional, you might remember that there was this guy, Nicodemus. He came to Jesus at night, had some questions, kind of was wondering about Jesus' authenticity. He says, I know what you're doing really amazing stuff. God has to be with you if that's all true. And Jesus comes back to him with things that Nicodemus finds puzzling. Talk about having to be born again, and Nicodemus doesn't understand. And Jesus tells him about the wind and how you can see the wind's effects, but you can't see the wind, and that's how God's Spirit is, and Nicodemus doesn't understand. And so now he's like, "How do you not understand all this stuff? I'm trying to give you everyday analogies like birth and wind, and you don't understand. Here, let me give you something. I don't know, let's throw in a weird story from the Old Testament that's kind of obscure." Well, it's not obscure to him, but it might seem obscure to us. He's a guy who's been in the Old Testament scriptures, otherwise known to him as the scriptures, all of his life. And so Jesus is going to bring in something that maybe you haven't heard of, but he's definitely heard of. Moses lifting up a serpent in the wilderness. So this is back from the book of Numbers, chapter 21. And so Moses the Hebrews are following him, Israel's following Moses, and they're actually following God, through the desert. And God's giving them food, and they complain about the food again and again. And there's one time they complain about the food, and these poisonous snakes come, and they start biting people, and the people are dying, and it's a big disaster. And they're like, "Save us from the snakes!" And God says to Moses, "Here's what you do. You get a stick, and you make a snake out of metal, and you put it on the stick." And Moses, okay, he does that. He puts a metal snake that he made on a stick and holds it up or props it up or something. And then what happens is that everyone who looks at the metal serpent, the metal snake on the stick, gets healed. Weird, huh? One of those things. And, it's a miracle, and they save the metal snake, and it gets passed down through generations, and eventually, hundreds of years later, they start worshiping it as though it's a god, and then that has to end because you can't worship other gods, so it gets destroyed, blah, blah, blah. There's all that history. But Jesus brings that in here now. And why does he bring that up with Nicodemus? Well, he says, just as Moses lifted up this serpent in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up. So the Messiah, him, is going to be physically lifted up on something so that lots of people can look at him. You might be guessing that it's the cross. Jesus is obliquely referring to the cross, saying that this weird thing that happened hundreds and hundreds of years ago, was something that is like what's going to happen to him. That people will look at him who has been lifted up and be healed and get eternal life. And he says, lifted up. And we'll see those words lifted up a couple more times in John. And what's cool is they can be taken in a few different ways, and it'll be used in a few different ways. But we've got the meaning that I already talked about, lifted up on the cross. But we know that 3 days after that, Jesus is lifted up from the grave, and that after that, he gets lifted up and ascended into heaven. So those are the things that are going to be, if you can't understand Nicodemus, if you can't understand these metaphors I'm using, if you even can't understand this allusion to the Old Testament, look to the cross and the resurrection and the ascension, and then you'll know that I'm the real deal.